The emergency room doors didn't just open, they detonated. 4 armed military police came through in a stack formation, rifles up, boots hitting the linoleum hard enough to scatter a crash cart and send a tray of instruments clattering across the floor. Patients screamed. Nurses flattened themselves against the walls. A doctor dropped his clipboard and didn't pick it up. They were moving toward one person. A 29-year-old nurse in faded scrubs stood at the end of the corridor, a bag over one shoulder, a termination notice folded in her front pocket. She didn't run. She didn't raise her hands. She just watched them come. The way someone watches weather roll in from a distance, certain and unstoppable and already accounted for. Then a voice cut through everything. "Stand down." The MPs stopped. A man in a decorated service uniform stepped through the doors behind them. Broad-shouldered, jaw set, the kind of face that had spent decades making decisions no one else wanted to make. He looked past the soldiers, past the frozen hospital staff, and found her directly, the way you find someone you've been looking for. "You have no idea," he said quietly, to no one and everyone, "who she really is." Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Check it. Ardenvale, Montana wasn't the kind of town that made the news. It sat in a wide valley between 2 ridgelines, population just over 40,000, with 1 regional hospital, 2 traffic lights on the main road, and a community that largely minded its own business. Harwick General Hospital served the valley and 3 surrounding counties, which meant it handled everything from ranch injuries and car accidents to the occasional cardiac event airlifted in from somewhere smaller. It was not a prestigious institution. It was a working one. Madeline Voss had come to Ardenvale 14 months ago. She'd applied for an ER nursing position, listed her credentials without elaboration, and shown up to the interview in a plain blazer with her hair pulled back. She gave short answers. She didn't volunteer information. The hiring manager, a soft-spoken woman named Doris, had told her afterward that she was the least talkative candidate they'd ever processed. Madeline had taken it as a compliment. She was good at her job. That part, everyone could see. She had the kind of hands that stayed steady in the middle of chaos. Not the practiced calm of someone performing composure, but something else. Something more mechanical and sure, like a system running on a frequency most people couldn't access. When an 18-year-old came in with a farming equipment laceration that had nicked his femoral, she'd controlled the bleed for 11 minutes with improvised pressure, while the attending got held up in another bay. When a toddler stopped breathing in the waiting room, she was already moving before the alert went overhead. She didn't talk about herself. That was the thing that irritated certain people. In a hospital where status moved through conversation the way blood moved through a body, constantly, in every direction, someone who didn't participate in the exchange made everyone else uncomfortable. Dr. Russell Page had noticed Madeline Voss on her 3rd shift. He was the chief of emergency medicine, 47, and he wore his authority the way some men wear expensive watches, visibly, always, as a reminder that it was there. He had not gotten to where he was by tolerating ambiguity, and Madeline Voss was, in his estimation, deeply ambiguous. "Where'd you train?" he'd asked her once in the hallway, the kind of question that sounds casual but isn't. "Registered nursing program out of state," she said. "Before that, field medicine." "Field medicine." He repeated it with the particular tone of a man filing something away incorrectly on purpose. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning I learned medicine in the field." He'd let it go because the answer gave him nothing to work with, and he was due in a meeting. But the exchange lodged somewhere in the back of his thinking, unresolved. The one who made it a problem was Glenn Harbert. Glenn was the hospital's director of administrative operations, a title that meant, in practice, that he controlled staffing, scheduling, complaints, and the paper machinery that determined whether someone kept their job. He was 53, had been at Harwick General for 19 years, and had survived 4 different hospital presidents by making himself indispensable to each one. He was not a doctor. He had never treated a patient. What he understood was leverage and how to apply it quietly and when to apply it loudly. He had taken a specific interest in Madeline Voss approximately 6 months into her employment When a patient complained about an unrelated staff member had, through a chain of misfiled paperwork that Madeline had corrected, ended up implicating a nurse Glenn had protected for years. The correction was accurate. The paperwork trail was clean. The implication was unavoidable. Glenn Harbert did not forgive that kind of thing. It started small, scheduling changes that put her on overnight rotations 3 weeks running. A formal note in her file about communication deficits following a peer review where 2 of the 3 reviewers were people Glenn had lunch with regularly. A meeting with HR where she was asked, in careful bureaucratic language, whether she felt her skill set was appropriately matched to an emergency nursing role, given her, and here the HR coordinator had paused to glance at her notes, non-traditional background. Madeline had sat through the meeting with her hands flat on the table and answered every question without expression. When it was over, she'd signed the documentation they put in front of her and walked back to the floor. She told no one what was happening. The campaign escalated in ways that were difficult to prove and impossible to ignore. A supply requisition she'd submitted for a patient with a compromised airway was delayed by 6 hours, technically within policy, practically dangerous. A commendation she'd received from a patient's family was removed from her file with a note that the form had been improperly submitted. When she raised it with her floor supervisor, a tired woman named Carla, who liked Madeline but was not prepared to go to war on her behalf, Carla had said, "Madeline, I'd let it go." "The form was properly submitted," Madeline said. "I know, but you're making it worse." "Am I?" she said. And that was the end of the conversation. Dr. Page became Glenn's most willing instrument. Whether the motivation was pride, territory, or the fact that Madeline had once corrected his medication calculation in front of a resident, quietly, without announcing it, writing the correct dosage on a separate line and sliding the chart back across the counter, was hard to say. Probably all 3. The correction had saved the patient from a dangerous interaction. Page had not thanked her. He had stared at the chart for a long moment, jaw tight, and then initialed it and left the bay. After that, he began challenging her in front of staff. Not constantly. That would have been obvious. But reliably. The way water finds a crack and works it. He'd question her assessments in rounds, offer alternative readings of symptoms she'd flagged, then present his reading as correct, even when the subsequent labs proved otherwise. He never apologized for those moments. He moved on, and everyone moved on with him, because that was the structure and no one wanted to challenge it. She had been at Harwick General for 14 months when it ended. The morning it happened, she was 11 hours into a 12-hour shift. The night had been relentless. A 3-vehicle accident on the highway that brought in 6 patients at once, 2 of them critical, and she had worked 2 bays simultaneously for 90 minutes while they waited for a second team to arrive. By 7 in the morning, the floor had thinned out and the waiting room was, for the first time since she'd arrived the previous evening, almost empty. Glenn Harbert came to the floor at 7:40. He never came to the floor that early. He was wearing a suit jacket over a collared shirt, which meant he'd come prepared. 2 HR representatives were with him, and Dr. Page was visible at the edge of the corridor, arms crossed, watching. Glenn stopped 6 feet from Madeline with the deliberate gravity of a man who had rehearsed this. "Ms. Voss, we need to speak privately." "I'm finishing a patient notation," she said without looking up. "The notation can wait." She finished the notation, set down the pen, looked at him. He had a folder. Inside the folder was a termination notice, which he slid across the nurse's station counter with 2 fingers like he was dealing a card. "Effective immediately," he said. "The hospital has determined that your continued employment presents an operational risk to the department." Around them, the floor had gone very still. A nurse 3 stations down had stopped typing. 2 residents near the supply room were frozen in place. "On what grounds?" Madeline said. "On the grounds outlined in the documentation." He tapped the folder. "You've been made aware of multiple performance concerns over the past several months. This follows a final review. I'd like to know who conducted the review." "That information is in the documentation." She picked up the folder, read it, set it down. The grounds listed were a composite of the notes that had accumulated over months. The communication deficit finding, a reframed version of the medication chart incident that described her as having interfered with a physician's clinical process, And a final item she hadn't seen before. A patient safety concern logged by Dr. Page 3 days ago, claiming she had failed to properly document a medication administration. She had documented the administration. The timestamp was in the system. She knew without pulling it up that the documentation existed because she had learned early that in this place the documentation was the only thing that couldn't be argued away. "This last item," she said, "the documentation exists in the system. You can verify it in approximately 30 seconds. Glenn looked at her with the patience of someone who had made up his mind before walking through the door. "Ms. Voss, this decision has been reviewed at the administrative level. I'd encourage you to gather your belongings and complete the exit process. HR will walk you through—" "You fabricated the safety concern," she said. The words landed like something dropped on a hard floor. Flat, solid, not going anywhere. Glenn's face didn't change exactly. Something behind it did. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I'd advise you not to repeat it. It's in the system. The documentation exists. You filed a safety concern about an event that is documented and time-stamped. That's a falsified report." Dr. Page had moved closer. He was at the edge of the nurses' station now, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular tightness of someone controlling something larger underneath. "Ms. Voss, you've been given a professional process here. Don't make this into something it isn't." "What is it then?" she asked. He didn't answer. She held the folder for another moment. Then she set it back on the counter. "I'll need a copy of this documentation," she said to the HR representative, who glanced at Glenn before giving a small, uncomfortable nod. She went to her locker, changed out of her scrubs, folded them and left them on the bench, put on her civilian jacket, picked up her bag, and walked the length of the corridor toward the exit without looking at anyone. The floor was still quiet. No one said anything. A nursing aide near the door made brief eye contact with her, and something passed between them. Not sympathy exactly, more like recognition. And then Madeline was through the door and into the cold morning air. She stood on the sidewalk outside Harwick General and looked at the parking lot. The sky was low and gray, the kind of mid-morning gray that Ardenvale did in spring before the weather made up its mind. She took one breath. 2. Her phone vibrated. She looked at it. An automated departure notification from the hospital system, stripping her badge access. She put the phone in her pocket, picked up her bag, and started walking toward the staff parking area. She was 40 feet from her car when she heard it. The sound arrived before the vehicles appeared, a low, organized roar that didn't belong to civilian traffic. It was the sound of convoy movement, multiple engines running in coordinated throttle, and she had heard it often enough in a former version of her life that her body responded before her mind caught up, shoulders straightening, head coming up, attention narrowing. 3 military vehicles turned onto the hospital access road in close formation, a lead Humvee, an armored transport, and a black SUV with tinted windows that had the deliberate anonymity of something that needed to be not noticed. Behind them came 2 more vehicles, one of which had a light bar that was not quite law enforcement, but not quite not. They moved with purpose. They were not lost. They were not here for a training exercise or a community event or any of the dozen civilian reasons that might bring military vehicles to a regional hospital. They turned directly toward Harwick General's emergency entrance. Madeline stopped walking. The convoy pulled up to the bay, and before the vehicles had fully stopped, the doors were already opening. 4 uniformed figures deployed from the lead Humvee in the practiced way of people who had done this in places where taking your time had real consequences. 3 more came from the transport. 2 individuals in civilian clothes, which, on them, looked exactly like a uniform in a different color, came from the SUV and were already speaking into earpieces before their feet hit the pavement. Then the rear door of the SUV opened and a figure in a service uniform stepped out. He was perhaps 55, with the kind of build that had once been powerful and was now just solid. The kind of solid that comes from a body that doesn't stop because it can't afford to. His face was weathered, jaw heavy, and he moved with a specific controlled urgency that Madeline recognized. Someone who was hurt and refusing to let that be the first thing anyone noticed about them. He paused at the entrance to the bay. His head turned. He was scanning. He found her from 40 feet away, across the parking lot, across the gap between the life she'd just been handed back and whatever this was. He found her the way you find a landmark you've been navigating toward for a long time, with relief that sharpened immediately into something else. His eyes stayed on her for 2 full seconds. Then a man beside him leaned close and said something, and the older man gave a short nod and let himself be guided through the emergency bay doors. But the second man, the one who had leaned close, stayed at the entrance. He was younger, perhaps 40, in a different uniform, and he had the focused stillness of someone who operated better in motion and was temporarily choosing not to. He looked at Madeline. Then he began walking toward her, deliberate and even, and she knew from the way he moved that he wasn't going to ask her for directions. He stopped 2 feet from her. "Madeline Voss," he said. Not a question. She looked at him. "Yes." "He asked for you by name," the man said, "before we left the airfield. He said, and I am quoting him directly, 'Get me to Harwick and get Voss,' in that order." The cold air moved between them. "He doesn't know I work here," she said. "He knew exactly where you were." The man's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted. Not surprise, more like the confirmation of something he'd expected to find complicated. "There's a situation. We need you inside." She looked at the emergency bay doors. Through the glass, she could see the controlled chaos of an unscheduled arrival. Glenn Harbert had appeared from somewhere, and he was standing near the registration desk with the look of a man whose morning had just become something he hadn't planned for. 2 of the uniformed figures were already in conversation with the charge nurse. A third had stationed himself near the trauma bay entrance in a way that was technically not blocking it and practically was. "I was just terminated," she said. The man looked at her without particular surprise. "I know. So I don't work here anymore." "No," he said. "You don't." He paused. "That's one way to look at it." She looked at the doors again, at Glenn Harbert's face through the glass, the administrative certainty draining out of it in real time as he tried to understand what the presence of military personnel in his emergency bay meant for the morning he had planned. "Who is he?" she asked. The man beside her was quiet for a moment, not hesitant, more like someone selecting the right level of disclosure. "His name," he said, "is General Warren Maddox." She turned to look at him. "3rd Special Operations Command," the man continued. "He presented with symptoms 4 hours ago at a forward facility near Billings. The facility didn't have the capacity, and he refused transfer to the regional military center. He was very specific about where he wanted to go." "Why here?" she said. "There are better equipped hospitals." The man's expression did the thing again. The small, almost invisible recalibration. "You'd have to ask him that," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. The sound of the emergency bay filtered through the glass. Voices, movement, the specific organized urgency of a trauma team that had just been handed something bigger than their usual Tuesday. Her termination notice was folded in her front pocket. The badge on her lanyard, the one the hospital system had just revoked access on, was still around her neck. "Voss?" The man said her name quietly, not urgently. "He's deteriorating. They've had him in there for 8 minutes and they're not reading it right." She looked at him. "How do you know they're not reading it right?" "Because I know what the injury is," he said, "and what I'm watching through that window doesn't match." She followed his gaze to the trauma bay, where Dr. Page had appeared and was now taking charge with the familiar authority of a man who had decided this was his room. She could see from here the tilt of Page's head as he reviewed the initial intake. She could see the patient, General Maddox, partially visible through the bay window, and even from this distance, even through glass, she could see the pallor and the particular stillness of someone whose body was spending everything it had on something internal. She had seen that stillness before. She knew what it meant. "He asked for me specifically," she said. "By name," the man confirmed. "Before we left. He said, 'If something goes wrong, get Voss.' He said you'd know what to do." She looked at the entrance, at Glenn Harbert, who had now spotted her through the glass and whose expression had hardened into the flat disapproval of a man who had just terminated someone and was watching them stand in his parking lot having a conversation he couldn't hear. She looked at the general's stillness through the window. She picked up her bag. "What's your name?" she asked. "Major Cal Renner," he said. "Special Operations, Medical Command." "Major Renner." She turned toward the entrance. "Walk with me." She was through these emergency bay doors before Glenn Harbert could get his mouth open, and the look on his face when she came back through those doors, when the woman he had spent months dismantling walked back in with a military officer at her shoulder, and the specific expression of someone who was done having the wrong conversation, was the first thing in a very long time that almost made her smile. Almost. There was a patient in that room who wasn't breathing right. Everything else could wait. Glenn Harbert moved to intercept her before she made it 6 feet past the entrance. He stepped directly into her path, shoulders squared, and for a moment the two of them occupied the same narrow strip of corridor while the emergency bay churned around them. Voices, cartwheels, the intermittent bark of a monitor being repositioned. "Ms. Voss?" His voice was controlled but not entirely. Something underneath it had gone tight. "You have been formally separated from this institution. You are not authorized to be on this floor." She didn't stop walking. She angled around him without breaking stride, and he had to physically turn to keep facing her, which put him off balance in a way she suspected he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm going to have to call security," he said. Major Renner, half a step behind her, said pleasantly, "That's your right." Glenn looked at him. At the uniform. At the two uniformed figures near the trauma bay who had oriented toward the conversation with the particular attention of people who were cataloging it. "This is a civilian medical facility," Glenn said. "Military jurisdiction does not—" "Mr. Harbert." Renner's voice didn't go hard. It went flat, which was more effective. "General Warren Maddox is in that trauma bay. He is a 3-star commander with active operational responsibility. His medical situation is time-sensitive, and he has made a specific request regarding his care team." He paused. "You are welcome to call security. You're also welcome to explain to the people in this building, and the people who will be reviewing this situation later, why you obstructed access to a requested care provider during a medical emergency." Glenn's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Madeline was already at the trauma bay window. Through the glass, she could see the team Paige had assembled. 2 residents, a charge nurse she didn't recognize from nights, and Carla, who had clearly been pulled from wherever she'd been trying to quietly finish her shift. Paige was at the head of the bed, reviewing something on a tablet, and he had the focused, territorial posture of a man who had decided this was the most important room in the building, and himself the most important person in it. General Maddox lay on the bay bed at a slight elevation. He was conscious she could see that much, the slight movement of his head, but the pallor she'd clocked through the parking lot window was worse up close. His lips had the faint gray undertone that didn't come from blood pressure alone. His hands, resting at his sides, were very still. She pushed through the trauma bay door. Paige looked up. His expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and then the brittle hardening of someone who has decided that surprise is beneath him. "What are you doing in here?" he said. Not a question. "Breathing assessment," she said, already moving to the left side of the bed. "You have been terminated. You have no clinical authority in this." "I'm not claiming clinical authority." She looked at the monitor. Oxygen saturation at 91 and trending. Heart rate elevated, not spiking. Compensating. Respiratory rate looked normal on the readout, but the chest movement told a different story. "I'm asking you to look at the chest." Paige took a step toward her. "Get out of this bay." General Maddox turned his head. His eyes found Madeline. He said her last name. Just that. "Voss." It landed in the room differently than any other sound that had happened in the last 20 minutes. Paige stopped moving. "I told them," Maddox said, and his voice was lower than it should have been. Not weak, but rationed, deliberate, the voice of someone managing a resource. "Get Voss." "General Maddox, I am Dr. Russell Page. I am the Chief of Emergency Medicine at this facility, and I assure you that you are receiving—" "Right side," Maddox said. He was looking at Madeline. It started on the right. She was already there. She put her hand on the lateral wall of his chest, felt the expansion, noted the asymmetry she'd clocked from the window. The left side moving, the right side moving less. Not absent. Less. And the trachea, she checked with 2 fingers, gentle, clinical, was sitting exactly where it should be, which meant whatever was happening hadn't reached full crisis yet. But it would. When did the pain start? She asked him. 3 hours ago, maybe 3.5. Felt like a muscle pull. His jaw was tight. Then it wasn't a muscle pull. Any trauma in the last 48 hours? A pause. Training exercise, nothing direct. Any hard impacts? A fall? Vehicle contact? Another pause. Longer. Hard landing, he said. Yesterday morning. She looked at the intake documentation on the secondary monitor. The notes from the initial assessment listed chief complaint as respiratory distress, possible cardiac origin. The imaging order was for a chest X-ray, standard, which was appropriate for possible cardiac and deeply insufficient for what she was looking at. You need a CT, she said to Paige, chest and upper abdomen, not a chest film. Paige looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to engage. The initial presentation is consistent with atypical cardiac involvement, he said. We are following the appropriate diagnostic pathway. The right side is restricted. It's not equal expansion. That's not a cardiac finding. I've done this for 23 years, Miss Voss. The X-ray is going to miss it, she said. Not loudly, not with any particular heat, just the fact of it placed in the room. Paige stared at her. The residents were looking at the floor. Carla was looking at the wall with the expression of someone who had very strong feelings and no intention of expressing them. Major Renner, who had followed her in and positioned himself near the door with the quiet authority of a person who could have filled the room if he'd chosen to, said, Dr. Page, we have General Maddox's full medical history from the military medical system. I'd like to share the relevant documentation with whoever is treating him. Page turned. And what documentation is that? His complete service record of injuries, including a prior right-side thoracic event from 2019. Renner reached into a document case that hadn't been visible until now. And the incident report from yesterday's training activity. Page took the documents with the careful hands of someone who doesn't want to look like the documents matter. He read for 45 seconds. His face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. The small, reluctant recalculation of a man encountering information that required him to adjust. We'll add CT to the imaging order, he said. To a resident, not to Madeline. She was already checking Maddox's pulse at the wrist. His skin was cool. Not cold, but cooler than it should have been in a warm room, which meant the body was making decisions about where to send circulation. How long for the CT? She asked the resident nearest to her. The resident looked at Paige before answering. 15 minutes to get the room ready, maybe. Okay, she said. Keep him at this elevation. Don't lay him flat. She looked at Paige. If we lay him flat, the pressure shifts and whatever's accumulating on that right side moves faster. Paige looked at her. Set the documents down on the secondary cart. I think you should wait outside, he said. We will handle the imaging and we will update the general's military escort as findings come in. He asked for me by name. I understand that, and I'm telling you that we, the clinical team, will be managing this case. He said clinical team with a slight emphasis that clarified what he thought she was. If you'd like to wait in the family consultation area, someone will come find you. She looked at Maddox. He was watching her with the expression of someone who had commanded enough people to read a room. He gave a small, almost invisible nod. Not permission, not agreement. More like acknowledgement. Like, I see what's happening here. I know you see it too. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it on the supply cart, walked out of the bay. In the corridor, Renner fell into step beside her without a word, and they walked together past Glenn Harbert, who had stationed himself near the nurses' station with the aggressive stillness of a man reasserting territory, and around the corner to where the main corridor opened into the waiting area. She sat down in a chair with the uncomfortable molded plastic that all hospital waiting chairs have, the universal design philosophy of spaces that don't want you to get too comfortable. She put her bag on the floor, put her elbows on her knees. He's got a hemothorax, she said. Right side. The hard landing from yesterday. Probably a rib fracture, slow bleed into the pleural space. It's been accumulating. That's why the X-ray pathway is wrong. Early hemothorax can look almost clean on a film if the blood hasn't layered yet, especially if the patient is sitting up. I know, Renner said. She looked at him. The facility in Billings reached the same conclusion before we transported, he said. I wanted to hear you say it. She studied him. Why? He sat down in the adjacent chair, which he did not appear to find uncomfortable in the way most people did. Because Maddox told me that if you said the same thing Billings said without anyone prompting you, we'd know he was right about you. Right about what? Renner looked at the corridor. He said he'd been keeping track of you, said he knew where you landed after you got out. He paused. He was surprised it was here. He said, and I am quoting again because the man has a memorable way of putting things, she could have gone anywhere. The fact that she's in a regional ER in Montana means she's hiding. Madeline looked at the floor. He's not wrong, she said after a moment. Not defensively, just as a fact. Renner nodded. He wanted to reach out when he heard you'd separated from service. Didn't because you'd made it clear you wanted a clean break. He glanced at her. Then this happened, and he decided clean breaks were a luxury he couldn't afford at the moment. She didn't respond to that. She was running the clinical math on Maddox, the accumulation rate of a hemothorax, the compensation a body could sustain, the point at which compensation became unsustainable. It wasn't abstract. It was specific and timed, and the 15 minutes the resident had quoted for CT felt like 15 minutes that was already partly spent. If they don't move quickly on the imaging, she said, and if the read takes time, I know. He needs a chest tube. Depending on the volume of accumulation, he may need it before they can get a proper read. I know that too. Renner looked at her. What I need to know is whether you can be in that room if it gets to that point. I don't have clinical authority here. You do, actually. He reached back into the document case. I didn't give Paige everything. He handed her a single folded document. She opened it. It was brief. 1 page, formal header, specific language. A temporary clinical credentialing authorization issued under military medical support protocols, naming her by full name, citing her service record and credentials, authorizing her to provide direct medical support to General Warren Maddox, active duty military personnel at any receiving civilian facility. It was signed by someone whose signature she recognized. This was prepared before we left Billings, Renner said. She looked at the document for a long moment. Who prepared it? The general did. Well, he authorized it. The JAG officer typed it. Renner took it back carefully. He said, I want Voss to have a seat at the table. Make it official. She sat with that for a second. In the corridor around the corner, Glenn Harbert's voice had risen slightly. She could hear him without being able to make out words, the characteristic tone of a man making phone calls he hoped were going to resolve something. Near the trauma bay, 2 of the uniformed figures had not moved. They had the patience of people trained to wait for a very long time and be operational the instant the waiting ended. Renner's radio, a compact unit clipped at his shoulder, made a sound. He listened to it without responding visibly, then stood. They're moving him to imaging, he said. She stood too. They were in the corridor when the trauma bay doors opened and the transport team came through with Maddox on the bed, wheels moving fast, Paige at the side, and 2 residents in orbit. The general's eyes found her again in the hallway, the same direct and deliberate contact. And this time he said nothing, but his right hand, closest to her, moved in a slight way that might have been voluntary or might have been the body's economy expressing something the voice couldn't spend. She walked alongside the transport without being asked, and no one stopped her. The CT suite was on the 2nd floor. While they waited for the machine to prep, Paige stood on the opposite side of the corridor with his arms crossed and looked at the middle distance. And Madeline stood near Maddox's head and watched the monitors, and the space between them had the particular quality of a conversation that both people knew was coming and neither was having yet. The scan took 11 minutes. The radiologist on call was a young woman named Dr. Asha Tomlin, who had the efficient manner of someone who had done a lot of overnight reads and didn't like wasting words. She came out of the read room with the images pulled up on a tablet, and she handed them first to Paige, which was correct protocol, and Paige looked at them for 10 seconds, and then Madeline watched something happen to his face that she had not expected to see. He looked up from the tablet and found her across the corridor. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down. Significant right pleural accumulation, Dr. Tomlin said. I'm estimating 400 to 550 milliliters. consistent with traumatic hemothorax. There's a hairline fracture on the 6th rib, right side, which is likely the source point. Page handed the tablet to a resident without a word. Madeline said to Renner quietly, "He needs a chest tube now. If the volume is already past 400, it's going to keep accumulating. They should have been set up for this when we walked in." "Tell him," Renner said. She crossed the corridor to where Page was standing. He was very still. He was doing something behind his eyes that she recognized, not from knowing him well, but from knowing what it looks like when a person is doing arithmetic about their own decisions and not getting the answer they'd hoped for. "Dr. Page," she kept her voice low. "He needs tube thoracostomy. Right side. The longer we stand here, the more volume we're dealing with. If it gets past 700, we're in a different conversation." Page was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'm aware of what he needs," he said. "Are you doing it here or moving him to a procedure room?" Another pause. It was a half-second pause, but she'd been in enough tight situations to know that a half-second was where bad decisions often lived. "Procedure room," he said. "Bay 3. And then, in a tone that cost him something she suspected he was not accustomed to paying, "I want you in the room." She didn't make anything of it. She just nodded and turned back to Renner, and they moved. The procedure was controlled but not smooth. Maddox's blood pressure had dropped 6 points during the transport from imaging, and his saturation had dipped to 89, which was the body announcing that the compensation phase was ending and the next phase was not going to be preferable. Page worked with technical competence. She gave him that. The man had hands that knew what they were doing, but when the initial attempt at positioning didn't give him the angle he needed on the insertion site, it was Madeline who adjusted Maddox's arm placement, and Page who accepted the adjustment without comment, and the tube went in correctly. The drainage was immediate. Dark, accumulated blood moving through the tube in the specific way that means the decompression has caught something real. Not too fast, which would be its own problem, but steady and purposeful, the body releasing what it had been holding for almost 18 hours. Maddox's blood pressure stabilized within 4 minutes. His saturation climbed, 90, 92, 94. His color, which had been the careful gray of someone spending down a reserve, came back by degrees. Not fully. He wasn't out of the woods, but enough that the monitor stopped its escalating commentary. He said from the table, "There she is." Page looked up. Maddox was looking at the monitor. Or possibly the ceiling, it was hard to tell. "That's what breathing is supposed to feel like," he said, to no one in particular. Page set down the instrument in his hand, pulled off a glove, did not look at Madeline. "We'll move him to the ICU for monitoring. I want labs every 2 hours. Repeat imaging in 4. "That's appropriate," she said. He looked at her then, just briefly, and there was something in it that wasn't an apology, was nowhere near an apology, but was in the same category of acknowledgement as what Maddox had done with his hand in the corridor, the registering of a fact that couldn't be unregistered. He left the room. She stayed another few minutes until the transfer team arrived, and when they moved Maddox to the gurney for the ICU transfer, he reached up and put one hand briefly on her forearm. Just a moment of contact, not dramatic. "You still read a room the same way," he said. "Rooms haven't changed much," she said. "You might be surprised." He settled back. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again. "We need to talk, when I'm not full of tubes. Rest first." "That's an order or a suggestion?" "Your call, General." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, which was already more color than it had been an hour ago. The transfer team moved him out. Madeline stood in the emptied procedure room and looked at the wall for a moment, doing nothing in particular, just letting the adrenaline chemistry of the last hour begin its recession. Her hands were steady. They always were, after. During, occasionally, not always, there was a fine tremor she'd never mentioned to anyone that lived somewhere in the right index finger during high-stakes moments, present and manageable, and gone by the time anything needed to be written down. When she walked out into the corridor, Major Renner was there, and Glenn Harbert was also there, and the two of them had clearly been standing in the same space for several minutes without speaking to each other in the specific charged silence of people waiting for the same person for different reasons. Glenn spoke first. "Whatever just occurred in that room," he said, "does not change the administrative standing of your—" "She has temporary clinical authorization," Renner said. filed under military medical support protocols. I can provide you a copy. Glenn's face did something complicated. That documentation would need to be reviewed by our legal... It doesn't need review. It's already in effect. Renner handed him a copy of the document, the spare he'd clearly had ready. You can have your legal team call the number on the header if you'd like to confirm. Glenn looked at the document. His hand was very still, the kind of still that comes from a man deciding how quickly he can reposition. Furthermore, Renner said, we've become aware of some questions about the administrative record here at Harwick General that we're going to want to address. Glenn's chin came up. What questions? General Maddox's team has been in contact with his office regarding the circumstances of Ms. Voss's employment here. The circumstances of her separation specifically. Renner's voice was even, professional, without aggression. We've been reviewing some of the documentation. The corridor was quiet in the way that a corridor gets quiet when the people moving through it have begun to sense something and are choosing routes that don't take them through it. Glenn said, that is an internal HR matter. It was, Renner agreed. Right up until the moment a falsified safety report was filed against a person whose service record we have significant interest in. He paused. You did file that report, Mr. Harbert? Glenn said nothing. Because it's in the system, with your authorization code. Renner tilted his head slightly. Timestamped 3 days ago, and the event it references, a documentation failure by Ms. Voss, has a corresponding entry in the system that directly contradicts the report. Timestamped 2 weeks prior. He paused again. That's not a misfiling. That's something else. The color in Glenn Harbert's face had undergone a shift. Not dramatic, not sudden. The slow interior kind that happens when a person realizes that the ground they've been standing on has been quietly reclassified while they were arranging furniture on top of it. I think, Glenn said carefully, that any further conversation about administrative records should involve counsel. That's your right, Renner said pleasantly. In the meantime, I've asked 2 of my people to ensure that the hospital's record systems remain accessible and unmodified pending a formal review. Glenn looked down the corridor. The 2 uniformed figures he looked at were not blocking anything. They were simply present, in the specific way that presence can be its own form of instruction. Glenn looked back at Renner, then, briefly, at Madeline. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Glenn Harbert was not, in that moment, a man experiencing guilt. He was a man experiencing the specific and novel sensation of having his exits quietly closed. He walked away. Not fast, not slow. The practiced neutral pace of someone who has decided that appearing composed is the only card left to play. Renner watched him go. Then he looked at Madeline. His records access has been flagged, he said. Anything he tries to modify or delete in the next 72 hours will be captured. She looked at him. How long have you been building that? Since the airfield, he said. Maddox told me what he knew about your situation here. I made some calls during the flight. She was quiet for a moment. He knew about what was happening here. He's been paying attention to you for a while, Renner said. Not in a... He wasn't watching in any inappropriate sense. He just kept track. He seemed to find the right phrase with some effort. He has that habit with people he trusts. She looked at the corridor where Glenn had gone, at the emptied space where the confrontation had just been. It wasn't over, she knew that. Glenn Harbert had counsel on retainer and 19 years of institutional armor and a specific talent for waiting out inconveniences. Whatever Renner had flagged, whatever review was now supposedly pending, those things were real, but they lived in process, and process had a way of favoring people who knew how to work it. She started to say something about that, and then her eyes caught movement at the far end of the corridor. Dr. Page was standing outside the ICU entrance. He was not on his phone, he was not speaking to anyone. He was standing still in a way that, on him, looked wrong. Page in stillness was not a natural state. It was an imposed one, the posture of someone who had received information and had not yet decided what to do with it. As she watched, a woman in civilian clothes approached him from the elevator. 30s, leather folio under her arm, the purposeful stride of someone who had already made the decision before she arrived. She handed him something. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up, and his gaze went down the corridor, and it found Madeline's. Even from 60 feet away, even at the end of a day that had rearranged itself 3 times before noon, she could read what was in his face. It wasn't the expression of a man who had just been vindicated. She took 1 step in his direction, then stopped. Beside her, Renner had seen it too, and he was already moving. Not toward Paige, but toward the woman with the leather folio, who had just taken a step back and was now speaking into her phone. Whatever was in that document, Paige was holding it like it weighed more than paper, and he was still looking at Madeline, with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something he spent the last 14 months refusing to see, and who now has to decide whether to run from it or turn toward it. The elevator behind the woman in the leather folio opened. 3 people stepped out, and none of them were hospital employees. 2 men and a woman stepped off that elevator, and the first thing Madeline registered was that none of them were moving like civilians. Not military either. Not uniformed. Not Renner's people. Something adjacent. The woman had a federal ID badge clipped at her lapel, visible but not announced. The kind of positioning that says, "You can see this if you need to, and I need you to need to." The taller of the 2 men was carrying a hard-sided document case of the type used for chain of custody materials. The third had a phone pressed to his ear and was already scanning the corridor with the systematic attention of someone mapping a room before they commit to moving through it. Renner was at the woman's side in 4 steps. She handed him something, a card, an ID, something small, and he looked at it, and whatever it said made him straighten slightly in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with recalibrating. Madeline stayed where she was. Doctor. Paige was still outside the ICU. He had folded the document he'd been handed and was holding it with both hands, the way people hold things they want to put down but can't. When she walked toward him, he saw her coming and didn't move. Didn't straighten, didn't retreat, just waited, which was itself unusual enough to be information. She stopped 2 feet from him. "What is that?" she asked. He held it out. She took it. It was a 4-page summary from the Office of the Inspector General, Military Health Systems Division. The header date was 11 days ago. It outlined a formal inquiry into clinical oversight failures at Harwick General Hospital, specific to the management of patient documentation in the emergency department over a 30-month period. It named, in the bureaucratic language of government documents that nevertheless managed to be clear about what they meant, 3 events where safety documentation had been altered or withheld. One of the 3 events involved a medication error that had been reclassified as a nursing administration failure after the initial incident report was amended. The original incident report had named the attending physician. The amended version had named a nurse who no longer worked at the hospital. The second event involved a patient transfer delayed by administrative hold, a hold that, per the document, had been entered without clinical justification. The third event involved a safety report filed against an ER nurse, documentation ref number attached, time-stamped 3 days ago. Madeline read to the bottom of the last page. The inquiry had been ongoing for 11 days. The summary she was holding was an interim finding. It was not a conclusion. It was a notice of escalation, meaning the initial findings had crossed a threshold that required broadening the scope. The scope had been broadened to include the hospital's Director of Administrative Operations. She handed the document back. Paige took it. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, he looked like what he actually was beneath the authority and the years, a doctor who had made choices, some of them clinical and some of them not, and who was standing in a corridor holding the paper evidence of which category certain choices fell into. "The OIG reached out to our legal department last week," he said. "I wasn't informed." "Were you supposed to be?" A pause. "Probably not, given that some of the events overlap with my department." She looked at him steadily. "Did you know about the third item before you filed the finding?" It was a direct question, and she waited for a direct answer, and she didn't know which answer she expected and didn't allow herself to care. What mattered was whether he told the truth about it. He met her eyes. "No," he said. "I knew Harbert was managing your exit process. I knew he had documentation prepared. I didn't know the safety report was fabricated." He paused, and it was the pause of someone choosing the next words carefully, not to soften them, but to get them right. I knew something was wrong with how it was handled. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact that happened to be accurate, and that was more useful than an apology. She nodded. I need access to the ICU. Yes, he said, and stepped aside. Maddox was in ICU Bay 2, wired to a full monitoring setup, drain tube in place, a respiratory therapist finishing the initial ventilation check when Madeline came through. His color had continued improving. The gray entirely gone now, replaced by the worn-out but living look of a body that had been in crisis and pulled back from it. He was awake, alert, specifically, the kind of alert that doesn't waste itself on the surrounding furniture. You saw the OIG document, he said. Not a question. Paige showed me. Paige didn't know he had it until 20 minutes ago. Maddox adjusted his position against the elevation with a controlled movement, the kind that manages pain without advertising it. My people requested the interim finding be delivered here, today. She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat. You've been running this in the background. My staff has. I told you. I knew what was happening to you here. I couldn't intervene directly without making it worse, but we could document. He looked at her. You're a person who documents, Voss. I learned that about you a long time ago. I was counting on the fact that you'd kept records. I kept records, she confirmed. Everything? Everything. Dated, backed up off-site. Something in his face settled. Not surprise, just resolution. Good. Because what Harbert did with that safety report was sloppy. The OIG found the discrepancy inside 48 hours. That's the thing about falsifying documentation in a time-stamped electronic system. It doesn't disappear. It just becomes evidence of itself. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the even pace of his monitors. His heart rate was good, blood pressure steady at the lower end of the normal, which was appropriate post-procedure. The drain was still active, small amounts, the tail end of what had accumulated, and the respiratory therapist's notes from the initial check showed bilateral breath sounds restored. The right side still slightly diminished, but no longer absent. He was going to be all right. She had known that for the past hour, but knowing it now, in the relative quiet of the ICU, was different from knowing it in the procedure room with Paige's hands and the tube and the dark blood moving through the drain. It was quieter. Why here? She asked. The military regional center would have been closer, better equipped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was not evasion. It was the look of someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. Because Billings told me I had a hemothorax and I needed a chest tube and I was going to be fine. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I thought, if I'm going to have someone put a tube in my chest, I want it to be someone I trust. He looked back at her. You're the best field medic I worked with in 14 years. That's not a compliment, that's a record. He paused. Also, I owed you a debt. This seemed like a way to begin paying it. You don't owe me a debt. I gave you a service record commendation in 2019, and then I watched you get pushed out of the branch you'd spent 8 years in, and I didn't do enough to stop it. Whether I owe you a debt is not really up for negotiation. She looked at him. Rest, she said. You keep saying that. You keep ignoring it. He closed his eyes. It wasn't capitulation. It was the decision of a person who had correctly identified where the next fight was and was conserving accordingly. She sat for another few minutes. Then she went back to the corridor. Renner was waiting for her, along with the woman from the elevator, who introduced herself as Supervisory Agent Diana Wolk, OIG, Military Health Systems. She was precise and not unkind, and she had the quality of people who do investigative work for a long time and have learned that being pleasant is faster than being confrontational. We're going to need your documentation, she said to Madeline. Whatever you retain from your time here, incident logs, communications, anything that relates to the administrative actions taken against you in the past several months. I have it. Volk nodded. We'd also like a statement, if you're willing. I'm willing. I want to be clear about what this is and isn't. Volk held her folio against her chest. This is an OIG inquiry. It is not a criminal investigation at this stage. However, depending on what the records show, and the preliminary read suggests there's significant material, It may escalate to referral. That means it's possible that at some point this moves beyond our office. Madeline understood what that meant. It meant that the falsified safety report and whatever else was in those records could eventually become a criminal matter. Understood, she said. There's one more thing. Volk glanced at Renner briefly. We've identified what appears to be a pattern. The 3 incidents in the interim finding are the ones we have clean documentation on. There are several others where the documentation is inconsistent in ways that suggest modification, but we don't yet have the original source material to confirm. If your records can fill any of those gaps, they can, Madeline said. The medication error from 14 months ago. I have the original incident timeline and the pharmacy system export from that shift. Volk's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind her eyes sharpened. That's one of the events where we have the amended version, but not the original. I know. I made a copy the day the original was filed, before the amendment appeared. This time Volk did not conceal her reaction. She looked at Renner just briefly, and then back at Madeline. Ms. Voss, she said, I think we should find a room. They used the hospital's second-floor conference room, which had been vacated without much discussion when Renner's people appeared at the door. Madeline's documentation was on her phone, encrypted, backed up in 3 separate locations, because she had known on some level that keeping this job was always a secondary concern, and keeping the record was the primary one. The statement took 40 minutes. Volk's colleague took notes. Renner sat in the corner with a coffee he didn't drink and listened to all of it without interrupting. What she had was thorough. More thorough than she'd allowed herself to think about directly during the 14 months she'd been building it, because thinking about it directly would have made it feel like a plan for failure, and she'd been trying not to fail. She had the original safety documentation from the medication incident, the scheduling change records, the peer review paperwork with the reviewer identities, the HR meeting notes she'd photographed before signing, and the system timestamp for the documentation that Glenn's fabricated safety report claimed didn't exist. She also had something she hadn't mentioned yet. When Volk finished with the primary statement and began organizing her notes, Madeline said, There's one more item. Volk looked up. The second event in your interim finding, the delayed patient transfer. She paused. The administrative hold that had no clinical justification. Yes. I know whose patient that was. I was on shift that night. The hold was entered by Harbert's credentials, but the clinical justification field, the one that's blank in your documentation, wasn't blank when I saw it. Volk was very still. What was in it? She asked. The patient had filed a complaint against a senior staff member the prior week. The complaint was in the system. The justification field referenced the complaint number. The room was quiet. It used a patient's complaint against a staff member as the clinical reason to delay the patient's own transfer, Madeline said. Renner put down the coffee. Volk uncapped her pen. I need you to show me exactly where that is in your records. The rest of the afternoon moved in the accelerated, bureaucratic way of things that have been building for a long time, and then suddenly have enough weight to move on their own. Volk's people were on the phone. Renner coordinated something from the hallway. The 2 uniformed figures who had been stationed near the trauma bay were now stationed near the records room on the administrative floor, which was a different kind of present. Glenn Harbert had been summoned to a meeting with Harwick General's hospital president, a man named Lawrence Odom, who had the look of someone who had received unexpected news and was still processing the altitude of it. Madeline didn't see that meeting happen. She heard about it from Carla, who appeared in the conference room doorway mid-afternoon with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something for a long time and has finally been given a room with the right acoustics. Glenn's in with Odom, Carla said. There are 2 people from OIG outside the door. Madeline nodded. Carla looked at her for a moment. I should have said something, months ago. I knew the peer review was wrong. I knew the scheduling was retaliation. She stopped. I have 2 kids. I'm not saying that's a reason. I'm just... I know, Madeline said. It's not enough. No, Madeline agreed. But it's honest. Carla nodded once, tightly, and left. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't the kind of thing that resolved cleanly. People made the choices they made and then lived in them, and the living was usually more complicated than the choosing. Madeline went back to the ICU at 4 in the afternoon. Maddox was awake. The drain had been assessed by the ICU team, and the output had slowed significantly. The bleed had been controlled, the accumulation resolving, and the repeat imaging order Page had written for 6 o'clock would likely confirm what his improving vitals already suggested. He was going to need the tube for another day, possibly 2, and then a course of follow-up imaging, and he was going to be uncomfortable for the better part of the next week, but he was going to be fine. He looked at her when she came in and said, "You gave them the delayed transfer documentation." "Word travels fast in ICS," she said. "Word travels fast when Renner is in the building." He shifted carefully. "How bad is it for Harbert?" She thought about how to answer that. The transfer documentation makes it something different from the rest. The rest is falsification for professional reasons. The transfer is using a patient's own complaint against a staff member to delay that patient's medical care. She paused. "That's not administrative misconduct." He held her gaze. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The monitor above his bed tracked his heart rate in its steady green line. Someone in the next bay was being settled by a night shift nurse, the low, efficient conversation of clinical care, and the intercom overhead paged a name she didn't recognize. "What happens to you now?" he asked. "After today." "That's a good question." "You can't go back to the ER. Not tonight. You're not on shift." He watched her. "And I don't think you'd want to, even if the badge access wasn't revoked." "My badge access is still revoked. Renner's working on that." She looked at him. "He's working on a lot of things." "That's what he's for." Maddox was quiet for a moment. "There's something I want to tell you about why I really asked for you specifically, not just because I trust your hands." He paused, and in the pause he looked older, briefly. Not diminished, just the full weight of the age sitting closer to the surface than usual. "I was in the building in Farouk province, when you went back in." She was very still. "I know," he said. "I was one of the ones who said you couldn't go back. One of the ones who said it was too dangerous and we'd lost the window and we had to pull back." He looked at her directly. "You went anyway, and you brought out 4 people." She said nothing. "I was wrong," he said. "I had better information than you did at the time, better tactical read on the structure, on the risk, and I was still wrong. You had something else. You knew those 4 people were alive and you went." He exhaled slowly. "I've thought about that a lot, about what it means when someone's right in a way that isn't about information." He stopped. "I didn't fight hard enough for you when you were pushed out, and I've been sitting on that for 2 years. So, that's the real reason I'm in your ICU." She looked at the window for a moment. Through it, the corridor, the ordinary movement of a hospital in the mid-afternoon. "You should rest," she said finally. "You keep—" "I know." She stood. "I'll be back before the repeat imaging." She was halfway to the door when she heard it. Not loud. Nothing that would have triggered a response from the nurse's station. A change in the rhythm of one of the monitors, the kind that the human ear picks up before the brain has processed what it means, and she turned back and looked at the readout, and then looked at Maddox's face. He was looking at his right hand. He had lifted it slightly off the bed, and there was a tremor in it that hadn't been there an hour ago. A fine, rhythmic instability that she cataloged alongside what the monitor was now starting to show. The blood pressure creeping down again, not precipitously, but wrong. Wrong in a specific way. She was at the monitors before the thought had completed itself, running the numbers. Pressure down. Heart rate up. Compensatory. Oxygenation still holding, but the drain bag, which she'd checked on her way in, she looked at the drain bag. The output had increased, not by a small amount. The color had changed. She hit the call button, then looked at the door, and the nurse was already coming, and Madeline said with the flat directness of a clinical emergency, no framing, no softening, "Get me the charge physician right now. He's re-bleeding." Maddox said from the bed, steady and measured, "How bad?" "I don't know yet." She was already checking the tube insertion site. Intact. The tube hadn't moved, which meant the problem wasn't mechanical, which meant the fractured rib had shifted, or the clot at the source point had failed, or something she hadn't been able to see on the initial CT had just declared itself. "Honest assessment," he said. She looked at him. We're going back to the procedure room, she said. His jaw tightened. That's not what I asked. That's my answer, she said. And then, because he was looking at her with the specific expression of a person who needs the real number, not the managed one, if we move fast, you're fine. If we're slow, the door opened. The charge physician was there, a different face from Paige. Evening shift, a younger doctor named Holt, whose eyes went immediately to the monitors and then to Madeline. What do we have? Holt said. Rebleed, right plural. I don't know the source yet, but the volume trend is... I see it. He was already on the phone. Then he stopped, looked at her. You're Voss? Yes. Paige left a note in the file. He put the phone back to his ear. He said, if something changes tonight and you're in this building, I should listen to you. A pause. I'm listening. She told him what she needed. He ordered it without hesitation. They were moving Maddox to the procedure room 40 seconds later, and the corridor filled again with the organized urgency of a hospital responding to something real, and Maddox was conscious and alert on the gurney, his eyes on the ceiling, and as they came through the ICU doors into the main corridor, he said without looking at her, Finish the mission, Voss. She was beside the gurney, moving at its pace. We're not done yet, General. No, he said. We're not. Outside the procedure room, waiting with the specific stillness of someone who had been standing in that corridor for 30 minutes already, was Glenn Harbert. He was not in his suit jacket anymore. He was in his shirt sleeves. His phone was in his hand, and he was looking at it, and he looked up when the gurney came through, and for a moment his eyes went to Maddox, and then to Madeline, and what was in his face was something she had not seen there before. It was not remorse. It was not guilt. It was calculation. The same thing that had always been there, but running on a different set of facts now, a different set of available outcomes, and arriving at conclusions that were making the blood drain from his face in a way that had nothing to do with the man on the gurney. Mr. Harbert, said a voice from behind him. He turned. Agent Wolk was there, and her colleague with the hard-sided document case, and a third person Madeline didn't recognize, who had the specific look of someone who carries documents that change the nature of a situation. We need you to come with us, Wolk said. Now, please. Madeline didn't watch what happened next. She was through the procedure room door. Maddox was on the table. The monitors were going up. Holt was gloved and ready, and he looked at Madeline across the table with the clear eyes of someone prepared to do the work. She gloved. She looked at the drain. She looked at the imaging Holt had already pulled up on the room's secondary screen. The portable units read, rushed and rough, but clear enough. There, she said, pointed. A small bright area at the inferior margin of the previous field. Holt looked. The rib fragment shifted. Yes, it's nicked something. Small vessel probably, but active. Can we manage it without opening? He asked. She looked at the image, at the trend, at Maddox's pressure on the monitor. She thought about the right answer, not the answer she wanted. Those were different things, and she had learned that they had to be different things. No, she said. Holt nodded, reached for the phone on the wall. I'm calling the thoracic surgeon, Dr. Arlen. Is Arlen good? He looked at her. Yes. How long? 20 minutes. She's in the building. 20 minutes was a variable number. It was long and it was short, and it depended on which direction things moved in the next 19 of them. Okay, Madeline said. Then we keep him stable for 20 minutes. She looked at Maddox. His eyes were open, on her. You hear that? I heard, he said. 20 minutes. I've held longer than 20 minutes in worse places, he said. His blood pressure dropped another 3 points on the monitor above him. She looked at the number, at the drain, at the image on the screen. Then she began to work. The 20 minutes didn't go cleanly. Nothing that mattered ever did. Maddox's pressure dropped another 5 points in the first 8 minutes, which put him in a range that was manageable but not comfortable. And Holt worked the left side while Madeline managed the drain output and monitored the imaging readout on the secondary screen, calling numbers when they moved and not calling them when they didn't, because the room already understood the situation and extra noise didn't help anyone. There was a moment around minute 11 where the rate of output from the drain increased in a way that made both of them look at each other across the table, and neither of them said what they were both calculating, because saying it wouldn't change the math, and the math was the same either way. Maddox was conscious through most of it. He'd closed his eyes at some point around minute 7, not from loss of consciousness, but from the specific economy of a person who has decided to stop spending energy on the parts of a situation they can't influence. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, the kind of breathing that isn't natural but is chosen, and the choosing of it was itself a form of steadiness that she recognized from other rooms, other tables, other hours when the difference between the outcome they got and the one they didn't came down to whether someone in the middle of it held or didn't hold. He held. Dr. Arlen came through the door at minute 19, which was close enough to 20 that it counted. She was 50-something, compact, with short gray-streaked hair and the unhurried efficiency of a surgeon who had learned years ago that urgency and haste were not the same thing, and that confusing them was how mistakes happened. She took one look at the monitor, one look at the secondary screen, and said to Holt, "Talk to me." He talked. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at Madeline, not with suspicion or surprise, just the direct appraisal of someone who wants to know who else is in the room. "You're Voss," she said. "Yes." "Holt says you called the re-bleed before the monitor caught it." "The drain output changed." "How long have you been watching the drain?" "Since I came back to check on him at 4. Arlen looked at the image on the secondary screen. "The fragment is here," she pointed. "I can repair this without a full thoracotomy if we're careful. It's going to take longer than a standard intervention, but it's the right call if his pressure holds." She looked at the monitor. "It's holding." "Barely," Madeline said. "Barely counts." Arlen was already at the scrub sink. "I want you at the secondary monitor calling vitals while I work. Holt manages the field. You're my second set of eyes." "I don't have thoracic surgical credentials." Arlen glanced at her over her shoulder. "I didn't ask for your credentials. I asked for your eyes." She turned back to the sink. "Renner's people already told me who you are. I'll take the liability." That was the end of the discussion. The procedure took 63 minutes. It was not smooth. The fragment had shifted further than the portable imaging had shown, which meant Arlen had to adjust her approach midway through, and there was a 10-minute period where the situation required the kind of incremental, nerve-testing precision that makes a room go completely silent, because everyone in it understands that the margin for error has narrowed to something that doesn't have a comfortable name. Madeline called vitals every 2 minutes and stayed off the radio and watched the screen and watched Arlen's hands and let the numbers be what they were. Maddox's pressure stabilized at minute 41. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. The line on the monitor simply stopped trending downward and held, and then, over the following 7 minutes, moved up by increments so small that each one individually was nothing and collectively they were everything. Arlen said, at minute 62, without looking up, "We're past the hard part." Nobody responded. The room had learned not to celebrate incrementally, which was its own form of professionalism. When Arlen closed and stepped back and pulled her gloves, she looked at the clock on the wall the way surgeons do, not to know what time it was, but to log it somewhere internal, the way every procedure gets filed with its timestamp in a mind that has accumulated hundreds of them. "He's going to be sore for 6 weeks, she said to the room in general. Maddox said from the table, "Noted." Arlen looked at him. "You're awake." "I've been awake for the last 40 minutes. "You were very quiet." "You were working," he said. Seemed rude to interrupt. Arlen made a sound that was not quite a laugh, tucked it away, and began dictating her post-op notes. Madeline stepped back from the secondary monitor and stood for a moment in the particular stillness that comes at the end of a long medical event, when the adrenaline is still circulating but has nothing left to respond to. Her hands were fine. The right index finger had done its thing and was already done doing it. Holt was at the door, speaking quietly to the transfer team. Maddox was being settled for ICU transport, his eyes closed again now. Real rest this time, not the managed kind. And as they moved him onto the transfer gurney, he reached out one hand without opening his eyes, a small gesture, and Madeline put 2 fingers briefly against his forearm, where the skin was cool and papery from the hours of monitoring leads. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They took him back to the ICU, and she stood outside the door for a moment in the corridor, which was quieter now. The early evening shift had settled into its rhythm, the particular steady state of a hospital between crises. And she became aware of how long she had been in the building and how much of that time had been spent in the specific attentiveness that leaves a person hollowed in a way that isn't unpleasant, exactly, but requires acknowledging. Renner appeared from the direction of the administrative floor. He looked at her face and read it accurately and said, "He's okay?" "He's okay." "Arlen's good." "Yes," she agreed. Harbert is in a conference room with Wolk and two people from the OIG's legal referral office. Renner stopped next to her, both of them standing at the ICU window. "It's not going well for him." She waited. "The delayed transfer documentation you gave them, the thing with the patient's complaint in the justification field, that was the piece they needed. Everything else was circumstantial in ways that Harbert's counsel could have worked with. That one isn't." He paused. "Wolk's colleague is on the phone with the county prosecutor's office. Has been for the last hour." She looked through the ICU window. Maddox was visible in his bay, wired and still, the monitors doing their patient work. "What else did they find?" she asked. "The peer review panels," Renner said. 3 of them, over 30 months, all convened by Harbert, all involving clinical staff he had prior conflicts with. 2 of the nurses are still employed here. 1 left 18 months ago." He paused. The review outcomes all resulted in file notes that were later used to justify termination or forced resignation. The reviewers had documented relationships with Harbert that should have required recusal. Nobody required it. "Page," she said. Not a question. Page was a reviewer on one panel. Renner's voice didn't soften or harden on it. "His legal situation is different from Harbert's. He participated in a flawed process, and he failed to ask questions he should have asked, but there's no evidence he knew the peer review was being used instrumentally." He glanced at her. That distinction matters. She thought about Page's face in the corridor, the document in his hands, the way he'd said, "I knew something was wrong with how it was handled." "He knew enough," she said. "Yes," Renner said. "He did, and he's going to have to account for that, just differently." She looked at the floor for a moment, at the scuffed linoleum of a working hospital worn in the specific patterns of traffic, the heavier wear near the nurses' station, the cleaner patches along the walls where people walked faster. "The 2 nurses still employed here," she said. "Their files. Wolk already has them. The file notes from the peer reviews. If the pattern holds, those notes are either fabricated or selectively presented. They shouldn't be in anyone's employment record. Wolk's team is working through it." He paused. "You're not the only person Harbert targeted. You were just the most recent, and the one who kept the clearest records." She absorbed that. There was no satisfaction in it, or there was, but it was the complicated, weighted kind that doesn't feel like what satisfaction is supposed to feel like, because the thing that makes it satisfying is the same thing that makes it heavy. Other people, in other versions of the same trap, with less documentation or less fortunate timing. "I want to be in the room when they talk to those nurses," she said. Renner shook his head. "That's Volk's jurisdiction. You can't be in that room." "I know." She looked at the window. "I'm saying I want to be." He nodded. "I'll tell Volk you said that. She'll understand what it means." Glenn Harbert's lawyer arrived at 7:15 in the evening, which was later than it should have been if the situation were what Harbert had initially told him it was. The lawyer's name was Marcus Fell, and he was good at his job in the specific way of a man who had spent 2 decades making institutional problems smaller and quieter. He walked into the conference room with the easy confidence of someone who has navigated these rooms before and found them manageable. He came out 40 minutes later to make a phone call in the corridor, and he was not carrying that confidence anymore. Madeline didn't see this happen. She heard it from Carla, who had officially ended her shift 3 hours ago and had not left the building, and who appeared periodically to provide updates with the focused, slightly guilty energy of a person making amends in the only way currently available to her. "Fell asked for a break," Carla said. "He went to call someone. He looked—" She stopped. "He looked like he needed to sit down." "He probably did." "What's in that room?" Madeline thought about the documentation. about the delayed transfer with the complaint number in the clinical justification field, about the peer review panels and the pattern across 30 months, and the two nurses whose files were now in Volk's hands. About the falsified safety report with the timestamp, the original medication incident report she'd photographed 14 months ago, the scheduling records, the HR meeting notes. Everything, she said. Carla was quiet for a moment. Glenn's been here 19 years. I know. He built a lot of this department, the processes, the oversight structures. He built them to protect himself, Madeline said. Not harshly, just accurately. Carla looked at the wall. Yeah, she said. I know. The hospital president, Lawrence Odom, walked through the corridor at 8 in the evening with the look of a man who had made several phone calls to the board of directors and received information on each one that made the previous call seem, in retrospect, optimistic. He stopped when he saw Madeline and looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression of a person who had been handed a situation already in progress and was still trying to locate where the beginning of it was. Ms. Voss, he said, Mr. Odom. I owe you. He started and stopped, started again. The hospital is going to want to speak with you formally, about your employment, about the process that was used to. He stopped again. I'm told the documentation is thorough. It is, she said. He nodded. He looked like a man doing arithmetic with numbers he didn't like. I want you to know that what occurred, the way your separation was handled, that is not. That doesn't reflect. He seemed to find the sentence he wanted. That should not have happened. She looked at him. No, she agreed. It shouldn't have. He nodded again, with the slight forward lean of a man accepting something he can't make lighter. Then he continued down the corridor toward the conference room, which was where, Madeline understood, the next several hours of his life were going to take place. She went to the cafeteria and got coffee that wasn't good, and a sandwich she ate half of because her body registered that it had been running on nothing since 7 in the morning and was issuing a complaint. She sat at a table in the nearly empty cafeteria and looked at the window that showed the parking lot in darkness and the distant line of ridgeline against the sky. And she thought about Maddox in his ICU bay, and about the 4 people she'd brought out of Farouk province, and about the things that had been said and not said in the procedure room, and she let herself be tired for 20 minutes, which was the right amount of time and no more. Then she finished the coffee and went back upstairs. Renner was in the hallway outside the ICU with a different energy than earlier, less contained, more activated, the shift of someone who has received new information and is deciding how quickly to move on it. There's a 3rd surgery note in Maddox's file, he said when she reached him. Pre-existing. From a procedure at a military facility in 2021. Page's team did the intake workup when Maddox arrived, and they flagged the surgical history in the system. That's standard. Yes, except the note wasn't in the documentation we brought with us. It was in Harwick General's system. He paused, and his tone had the specific flatness of something that needs to be said carefully. Someone accessed that note this afternoon, at 14:22, after we arrived. They accessed it and then accessed Maddox's current admission record and cross-referenced the two. She looked at him. Someone at the hospital pulled his prior surgical history after he arrived. Yes. Who has credentials to access both a historical surgical note and a current ICU admission file? Clinical staff, he said. An administrative staff with elevated access. She thought about who had elevated administrative access, about who specifically, in the last several hours, had reason to be looking at Maddox's medical history. What time did the delayed transfer documentation go to Wolk? She asked. Renner's jaw tightened slightly. 14:15. 7 minutes before the access log. Harbert accessed Maddox's file, she said. We think so. The access credentials are his. We're verifying. He was looking for something he could use. She said it as she thought it, working it out. The OIG shows up, the documentation starts moving, he realizes the delayed transfer is the piece that breaks it, and he goes into the system looking for something to trade, something about Maddox, something he could use to complicate the situation. That's the working assumption. Did he find anything? Renner was quiet for 1 second. The 2021 surgical note documents a procedure that was performed under a security classification. The note in the system is a civilian summary, no classified detail. But the fact of the procedure and the facility and the timeline, he could use the fact of it to imply something, she said. Yes. Even without knowing what it was. Yes. She looked at the ICU window. He's going to try to trade it. Tell the prosecutor there's something irregular about Maddox's medical history. Introduce doubt about why a classified surgery is in a civilian hospital's system. Make it look like, we know, Renner said. Volk knows. The access log is time-stamped, and it's going to be part of the record. He paused. Accessing a military patient's records without authorization or clinical cause is a separate violation. He just added to his stack. Did he know that? Renner looked at her with something that wasn't quite tiredness and wasn't quite frustration, but lived in the same county. Glenn Harbert has spent 19 years believing that the way the information systems work at this hospital is the way information systems work everywhere. That when he controls the records, he controls the record. A pause. He doesn't understand that a military patient's admissions file gets flagged for access monitoring the moment the patient presents. Every entry, every read, every credential that touches it. She understood what that meant. The moment Maddox came through the doors of Harwick General, his file had become a monitored document. Every person who had touched it since, including Harbert, at 1422, 7 minutes after the most damaging documentation of the day went to the investigators, had left a logged, time-stamped, attributed trace. He handed them another charge, she said. He handed them 3, Renner said. Unauthorized access to military patient records, attempted use of protected health information, and based on what Volk's legal referral contact told her 20 minutes ago, obstruction. Because accessing that file when he did, given what was happening in the conference room, is going to be characterized as an attempt to interfere with an active inquiry. She looked at the floor, at the linoleum. He panicked, she said. It wasn't sympathy. It was just the recognition of a thing. People like Harbert don't panic in a way that makes them do less, Renner said. They panic in a way that makes them do more, and more of the wrong kind of more. Down the corridor, the conference room door opened. Marcus Fell, Harbert's lawyer, came out and looked toward the elevator with the expression of a man who had been in the room when his client described accessing the military patient's records and had understood immediately what it meant, and was now performing the mental calculation of exactly how far past the threshold of effective defense the situation had traveled. He got in the elevator. The door closed. Madeline looked at the closed elevator door for a moment. Then the conference room door opened again, and Agent Wolt came out, and behind her, Glenn Harbert. He was in his shirt sleeves still. Someone had given him a cup of water at some point, and he was holding it, mostly empty, at his side. He looked the way a building looks just before the structural failure. Still upright, geometry intact, but something fundamental in the load-bearing components already not where it's supposed to be. He saw Madeline in the corridor. He stopped. Volk's hand went to his arm, not restraining, just present, the guidance of someone managing a person in a situation. Harbert looked at Madeline for a long moment. His face moved through something she didn't have a name for, and she didn't try to name it because whatever he was feeling, she understood, was his to carry. It wasn't her job to make it easier or harder. She had documentation, and he had choices he'd made over years, and those two things had come into contact today and produced this corridor and this moment, and that was simply what had happened. She held his gaze until he looked away first. Volk moved him toward the elevator. The two OIG colleagues flanked without crowding, the practiced geometry of people who do this and know that it doesn't need to look dramatic to be final. The elevator came. They got in. The door closed. The corridor was quiet. Renner stood beside her, and they both looked at the space where the elevator had been, and after a moment he said, "Formal charges will be filed in the morning. The criminal referral went to the county prosecutor 2 hours ago. The hospital board has been notified of the OIG findings and the terms of the inquiry expansion." He paused. "Odom is going to make a statement to staff tomorrow." She nodded. "Your badge access will be restored tonight," he added. "Odom authorized it an hour ago." She looked at the lanyard around her neck, the revoked badge. She'd been wearing it all day out of habit or stubbornness or some combination she hadn't examined. "Page is still on shift," Renner said. He came to the procedure room while Arlen was closing. He didn't come in. He stood at the window. A pause. He stood there for about 10 minutes and then went back to the floor. She thought about what 10 minutes at that window meant and didn't say anything about it. "The two nurses," she said. "The ones whose files Volk has. Do they know yet?" "Volk spoke to them this afternoon, both of them." Renner's voice shifted. Not much, but enough. "One of them had the peer review note in her file classified as a performance concern. She's been on probationary status for 8 months. She thought she was about to lose her job." He stopped. "She's 24. Madeline closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "She's not losing her job," she said. "No," Renner said. "She's not." She went to check on Maddox at 9:30. He was asleep. Real sleep. The heavy, non-negotiable kind that comes after surgical repair and blood loss, and a body that has spent all of itself getting through a day. His vitals were good. The drain output was minimal. The monitoring leads traced their green lines across the screen in the patient, in different way of machines doing exactly what they were designed to do. She stood at his bedside for a few minutes. She thought about what he'd said. About Farouk Province, about being wrong, about the debt he'd decided he owed her. She thought about how a person carries something for 2 years and finally puts it down, and whether the putting down is the resolution or just a different kind of weight. She didn't have an answer for that. She rarely had answers for those kinds of questions. What she had were records and timestamps, and the quiet, unpretentious competence of someone who had learned that the only reliable thing in most situations was the work itself, done correctly, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Maddox had watched. It turned out. From a distance, for years. She went home at 10 o'clock. Her apartment was a 10-minute drive from the hospital, the second floor of an older building with a view of the back parking lot and a kitchen that she used mostly for coffee. She changed out of her clothes, stood in the shower until the water went lukewarm, made coffee she didn't drink. She sat at the table in the kitchen and opened her laptop and looked at her documentation files, the organized archive she had built over 14 months, neat and dated and backed up in 3 locations, the paper skeleton of everything that had happened to her in this building. She had looked at these files many times. She had never done anything with them because the time hadn't been right. And then the time had become today, and now they existed in the hands of federal investigators and a county prosecutor's office and the record systems of the United States military. She closed the laptop. Her phone lit up on the table. A message from a number she didn't recognize, which resolved when she looked at it to be Renner's direct line, which she apparently had now. "Maddox is stable. Good night, Voss." She put the phone face down and looked at the ceiling, the thing that she hadn't let herself think about directly, the thing she'd kept in the peripheral vision of her thoughts all day, because looking at it straight on would have made the other work harder. Was what came next. What came after an OIG inquiry and a criminal referral and a hospital board notification. After badge access restored and a formal statement from the hospital president, after Glenn Harbert getting into an elevator with federal agents on his left and his right. She had been in Ardenvale for 14 months. She had come here because it was small and quiet and required nothing from her except competence, and competence she had in abundance and was willing to give. She had not come here to be known. She had come here specifically to not be known, and for 11 months that had worked exactly as intended. She thought about Major Renner saying, "He said she's hiding." She thought about Maddox saying, "Finish the mission." She thought about the 24-year-old nurse on probationary status for 8 months because of a falsified peer review. She thought about the other name on the list, the nurse who had left the hospital 18 months ago, who was somewhere else now, possibly with the same peer review note in her file, possibly in another institution where someone with Harbert's talent for systems and leverage had read it and decided what it meant. She picked up her phone, opened the message from Renner, typed, "The nurse who left, 18 months ago. I need her name." Put the phone down. It lit up 40 seconds later. She looked at the name. She recognized it. She recognized it because she had worked 3 shifts with that nurse in her 2nd month at Harwick General, before the woman had disappeared from the schedule 1 week without explanation. And Madeline had asked Carla where she'd gone, and Carla had said, carefully, that it was complicated, and Madeline, 14 months ago, new to the hospital, not yet reading the architecture of what was being built around her, had let it go. Her name was Priya Nault. She was 31. She had been, in the 3 shifts Madeline remembered, one of the most naturally capable nurses she'd worked alongside, clean in her assessments, fast in her responses, the kind of person who doesn't explain what they're doing because they're already doing it correctly. Madeline had let it go. She held the phone. Then she opened her archived files on the laptop. She searched by date, the period covering her first 2 months before she'd understood what she was inside. She found it in 7 minutes, a shift log from her 7th week, an entry she'd written in her personal documentation habit, clinical notes to herself, not for the hospital system, just the discipline of recording what happened on a shift so she could review it later. The entry described an incident she'd witnessed, a medication discrepancy flagged by a nurse, a conversation with a senior staff member that had gone badly, the nurse filing something in the system before the end of shift. She had noted the nurse's name, Priya Nault. She had documented 14 months ago, and without knowing its significance, the original incident that had preceded the peer review that had preceded the departure of a nurse who had been, by every indication, doing exactly what a nurse was supposed to do. She had the record. She hadn't known she had it, but she had it. She typed the message to Renner before she'd fully decided to. I have documentation on Nault's original incident, from 7 weeks into my employment. I didn't know what I was looking at then. I know now. The phone lit up. Renner, send it to Wolk. She was already opening her files to do exactly that when her phone lit up again. Different number this time. A hospital number. The ICU nurses station. She answered. Ms. Voss. It was the night charge nurse, a steady-voiced woman she'd met briefly during the evening's chaos. General Maddox is awake. He's asking for you. She looked at the clock. Nearly 11. He should be sleeping, she said. I told him that, the nurse said. He said, and I'm quoting, tell her it's important. Tell her Harbert left something in the system before Wolk's people locked it down. Madeline was already standing. What did he leave? I don't know. He said you'd know what it means. A pause. He also said, and I'm still quoting, tell her she needs to see it before morning, because by morning someone's going to try to make it disappear. She picked up her keys. She drove back to Harwick General in 11 minutes, which was 2 minutes faster than the route allowed for comfortably, and she didn't think about that. The night parking lot was thin, a handful of staff vehicles, 2 cars near the ER entrance that belonged to people waiting on someone inside. She went through the main entrance because her badge access had been restored, and she wanted to know if it was real. It was. The reader beeped green and the door opened, and she walked through without breaking stride. The ICU at 11:15 had the particular quiet of a ward that has settled into its overnight rhythm. Lower lights, slower movement, the monitoring sounds reduced to a frequency that the night staff learned to filter. The charge nurse who had called her was at the station, and she looked up when Madeline came through and gave a nod toward Bay 2 without being asked. Maddox was sitting up at an angle that was probably more than his thoracic surgeon would have recommended. He had his tablet on his lap, and he looked, for a man who had spent the day hemorrhaging into his own chest cavity, alarmingly alert. You should be asleep, she said. You should have a better night shift, he said. Sit down. She sat. What did Harbert leave in the system? He turned the tablet toward her. On the screen was a document, not a hospital record, not a clinical file. It was an internal communication, formatted as an interdepartmental memo, dated 8 months ago, and it was addressed to Dr. Russell Page. She read it. It took her 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds the quiet of the ICU continued around her. A monitor in a nearby bay tracked someone's steady pulse. A nurse moved through the corridor outside with the soft efficiency of good night staff. And none of that touched the space inside her where she was reading the memo and understanding what it was. The memo was from Glenn Harbert to Page. It outlined in the careful language of institutional communication that has learned to mean things without saying them directly, a coordinated approach to what it called managing the performance trajectory of 2 nursing staff members. One of the names was hers. The other was a name she didn't recognize, a newer hire, apparently flagged for similar reasons. The memo referenced the peer review process as a tool. It used the phrase documentation architecture to describe the construction of a record that would support future termination. It noted that the scheduling adjustments already in place were producing the intended stress indicators. It was in plain language a written plan for a coordinated campaign against specific employees, and it had been sent to Paige. And Paige had not responded in writing, which was itself a form of response. She set the tablet down. Harbert filed this in the hospital's internal communications system, Maddox said. Not the personnel system. The General Communications Archive. Probably figured it was less likely to be pulled in a personnel review. He paused. When Volk's people locked down the record systems this afternoon, they locked the personnel files and the clinical documentation. The General Communications Archive has a different access tier. Harbert went in there tonight, before Volk's people flagged it, and he moved this document. Moved it where? To a folder labeled Facilities Management, Maintenance Logs 2022. He said it without inflection. He was trying to bury it in the most boring part of the archive. She looked at the tablet. But the movement itself is logged. Every action in that system is logged. The document's access history shows the original file location, the time it was created, and then the move, time-stamped at 16:58 today, which is 36 minutes after Wolk's people entered the conference room with Harbert for the first session. He picked up the tablet. He knew the memo existed. He knew it could break him. He tried to hide it while he still had access. A pause. He didn't know that the move would be the thing that confirmed it was worth hiding. She looked at him. How did you find it? Renner's people monitor flagged access patterns. When Harbert's credentials touched the communications archive, which is not where you go when you're cooperating with an investigation, they pulled the access log and ran it forward from the timestamp. He set the tablet on the side table. Renner sent it to me. I sent it to Wallach 20 minutes before I called the nurses' station. You already sent it to Wolk? Yes. So why am I here? He looked at her for a moment. His face in the low ICU light was tired and older and honest in the way that people become honest when they've spent a day close enough to the edge to recalibrate what matters. Because I wanted you to read it, he said. Not as evidence. As a person. He paused. Because you spent 14 months in this building thinking you were imagining something, or overreacting to something, or failing to manage something that was actually your fault. And you were none of those things. You were exactly right about what was happening to you, every step of the way. He looked at her steadily. I wanted you to read the document that proves it, before it becomes a piece of evidence in a legal proceeding and the language gets cleaned up and processed, and you only ever see it as a citation in someone else's filing. She looked at the tablet on the side table. She had known. She had known from the first scheduling change, from the peer review with reviewers who ate lunch with Glenn Harbert, from the fabricated safety report she'd been able to disprove in 30 seconds by opening the system. She had known, and she had documented, and she had not allowed herself the full weight of knowing because the full weight would have made the work harder, and the work needed to be done. I didn't imagine it, she said. No, he said. You didn't. She sat with that for a moment. It wasn't vindication in the loud, dramatic sense. It was quieter than that and more complete. The specific, grounded relief of a person who has been carrying a question for a long time and has finally been given an answer that matches what they already knew. She picked up the tablet. Read the memo one more time. Then she set it down, pulled out her phone, and forwarded Maddox's copy to Wolk's contact number with a single line. He moved this document at 16:58 today. Access log confirms. You'll want the original file location. Wolk responded in 4 minutes. 2 words. Already have it. Madeline put her phone in her pocket. You should sleep, she told Maddox. I've been hearing that all day. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Tomorrow, he said, is going to be someone else's long day. He settled back against the elevation, the careful movement of someone managing post-surgical discomfort without making it the center of the conversation. My day tomorrow is going to involve a lot of lying in this bed, not rebleeding. That's an excellent plan, she said. He looked at her. Wolk is going to want you back in the morning. Formal statement about the memo. About the full scope of what you observed. He paused. Are you ready for that? I've been ready for 14 months, she said. I just didn't have a room to walk into. He nodded, closed his eyes. She left him sleeping. By 7 the next morning, the news had moved through Harwick General the way news moves through small institutions. Not announced, not broadcast, but present everywhere, in the sideways conversations at the nurses' station and the silence in certain offices, and the way people who usually kept their eyes down were keeping them up, scanning, recalibrating. Glenn Harbert did not come in. His office was locked. The nameplate on the door was the only thing that remained of his 19-year presence in the building, and by 8 o'clock there was a facilities staff member removing it, not hurrying, just doing the job. Dr. Page was on the floor. He was doing rounds. He was doing them differently than usual, with a quietness that wasn't his native mode, a deliberateness that suggested a person operating with some new understanding of the weight of each decision. When he passed Madeline in the corridor at 7:40, he stopped. I gave a statement this morning, he said, to Volk's team, about the peer review panels, about what I knew and what I chose not to look at. She waited. It was a full statement, he said. I didn't minimize anything. She looked at him. She thought about what it costs a person like Page, a man whose professional identity was built on being the one who knows, the one who decides, the one who is right, to walk into a room and give an account of his own failures without softening them. She didn't know if it was enough. Probably it wasn't enough on its own. But it was the right direction, and the right direction mattered, and she had never been someone who confused direction with arrival. Okay, she said. He nodded. Went back to rounds. Lawrence Odom made his statement to hospital staff at 9 o'clock in the main conference room. It was not a brief statement, and it was not a comfortable one. He named Glenn Harbert. He named the OIG inquiry. He confirmed the criminal referral to the county prosecutor's office. He confirmed that the peer review processes implicated in the inquiry were under review, and that the employment records of affected staff were being audited. He said, in language that was formal and careful but clear, that what had happened in this institution over the past 30 months was a failure of oversight at multiple levels, and that the institution accepted accountability for that failure. Madeline was not in the room for the statement. She was in the ICU checking on Maddox, whose morning vitals were good and whose drain output had dropped to trace amounts overnight, which meant Arlen would likely remove it by afternoon. She heard about the statement from Carla, who had been in the room and who came to the ICU doorway afterward with the uncertain face of someone who has just watched a building shift on its foundation and isn't sure yet how much is going to be left standing. He said your name, Carla said. Odom. He said that the actions taken against Ms. Madeline Voss represented a deliberate misuse of the hospital's administrative processes, and that the hospital owed her both an apology and a correction of the record. Madeline looked at the monitor above Maddox's bed. His heart rate was steady. Good and steady. Was that the exact language? She asked. Word for word, Carla said. I wrote it down. She paused. He also said the hospital would be reaching out to all affected staff, that the peer review outcomes would be expunged from personnel files where the process was found to be compromised. Madeline thought about Priya Nold, wherever she was now, whatever institution had inherited the file note that Harbert's peer review had put there. The nurse who left, she said. Noel. Has anyone reached her? Wolk's team called her last night, Carla said. She's in Billings. She's been working at a clinic there. A pause. Carla said she cried when they told her. Madeline looked at the floor. Her file note from the peer review. It needs to follow the correction, not just the one here. If she's applied anywhere else, if it's been referenced, Wolk's team is handling it. They told her directly. Carla hesitated. She asked about you, Naul. She asked if you were the one who had the original documentation of the incident. She stopped. Wolk told her yes. Madeline was quiet for a moment. She hadn't known, when she'd written that shift log in her 7th week, what she was preserving. She'd just been doing what she always did, keeping the record because the record was the only thing you could control when everything else was subject to other people's decisions. She'd written it and filed it and kept it in the same place she kept everything, and 14 months later it had become the thing that could give a 31-year-old nurse in Billings her professional reputation back. Documentation was like that. You never knew which entry was going to be the one that mattered, so you made them all matter. "Tell Wolk I want to talk to Noel," Madeline said. "Not officially, just—" She stopped. "Just to talk." Carla nodded. The formal statement to the OIG took 3 hours that afternoon. It was thorough, and it was on the record, and it was the last large piece of the documentation work that had started 14 months ago in the small private discipline of a shift log. When it was done, Volk shook her hand with the brisk professionalism of someone who doesn't do sentiment in work settings, and then said quietly, before she left, "You built a record that most people in your position don't have the discipline to build. That record is what made this case." She paused. "I want you to know that." Madeline nodded. She meant it. She could tell that Volk meant it, and she accepted it as the thing it was. Not a compliment exactly, but an accurate statement of fact from someone who had spent a career looking at evidence and knew what it looked like when it was good. Glenn Harbert was formally charged 3 days later. The county prosecutor's office filed on 4 counts: falsification of medical records, unauthorized access to protected military health information, obstruction of a federal inquiry, and, on the basis of the delayed transfer documentation, the one where a patient's own complaint had been used as the clinical justification for delaying that patient's care, 1 count of reckless endangerment. His counsel entered a not guilty plea. The arraignment was public record, and it became, within 24 hours, the kind of local news story that travels because it contains the specific combination of institutional betrayal and paper trail that people find simultaneously outrageous and legible. His photograph appeared in the regional news cycle. His 19-year title appeared in the caption beneath it. The headline did not need to editorialize because the facts were sufficient. Madeline did not read the article. She heard about it from enough people that she understood its general shape, and that was enough. Page's situation was, as Renner had said, different. The hospital board's internal review found that he had participated in a compromised peer review process without adequate investigation into its basis. He was placed on a performance improvement plan, a formal one, with oversight, with documented checkpoints. His position as chief of emergency medicine was suspended pending the review's completion. He kept his clinical privileges, with conditions. It was not a clean outcome for him. It was not a ruined one. It was the specific, uncomfortable middle territory that accountability produces when it's applied honestly to someone who did real harm without deliberate malice and lived in the difficult space between those two facts. She didn't have a strong feeling about the Page outcome either way. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that she had decided, somewhere in the 72 hours since the OIG first walked through the elevator doors, that her emotional energy was not a resource she was going to spend on the measurement of other people's consequences. The consequences were there. The process was doing what processes do when they have sufficient evidence and sufficient pressure. That was what she had worked for, not the specific arithmetic of punishment, but the fact of accountability itself. Its presence in the room, legible and documented and real. Her employment record was corrected. The performance notes, the fabricated safety report, the peer review outcome, all of it expunged, replaced with a neutral reinstatement notation and a record that reflected her actual 14 months of work at Harwick General, which was, when stripped of Glenn Harbert's architecture, the record of someone who had done her job well. Odom offered her a formal apology in his office, in person, across a desk, with no one else in the room. He was awkward about it in the way that institutional leaders are awkward when they're trying to speak as humans rather than representatives, and she gave him credit for making the attempt rather than sending a letter. "We'd like you to stay," he said. "If you want to stay, that's entirely your choice, and there's no pressure in either direction." "I know," she said. "You would be coming back to a different department in some ways. Page, I know about Page. The staff, I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think the staff would be glad. The ones who worked with you. I've had conversations in the last few days with people who—" He chose the words carefully. "People who knew something was wrong for a long time, who weren't in a position to say it." She thought about Carla. about the nursing aide who'd made brief eye contact with her on the morning she walked out with the termination notice in her pocket, about the resident who'd looked at the floor when Paige challenged her in the procedure room. Institutions were made of those people, the ones who knew and couldn't say. They weren't villains. They also hadn't been heroes. They were the vast, complicated middle of every workplace, doing the calculation every day between their conscience and their circumstances and not always landing on the right side of it. She understood that. She had her own version of that calculation. She had made the documentation habit precisely because she had known, from the first month, that she might someday be exactly where she'd been yesterday, walking out a door with a termination notice and no one willing to stand in front of her and say, "This is wrong." So she had built something that didn't need anyone to stand in front of it, something that would stand by itself. "I'll stay," she said. Odom exhaled, briefly, controlled, but she caught it. "Good," he said. "That's good." She went back to the floor the next morning, her first shift back. The badge worked. The locker still had her combination. Someone had put a new coffee mug on the break room counter with a yellow sticky note that said, "Welcome back," Voss in handwriting she didn't recognize. And she looked at it for a moment and then made coffee in it because it was there and she needed coffee. Maddox was transferred to a military medical facility 2 days after Arlen removed the drain. He was stable, ambulatory, and characteristically direct about the fact that he was done being monitored every 2 hours by people who wouldn't let him read his own charts. Before the transfer van came, she went to say goodbye. He was dressed, civilian clothes, the careful movement of someone whose right side was still making its displeasure known. And he looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the parking lot 3 days ago, like someone checking a coordinate. "You're staying," he said. "Yes." "Good." He picked up his bag, too quickly, and his face did a thing that he immediately controlled. "I have a proposal." "You should sit down." "I have a proposal," he repeated, ignoring the suggestion. "There's a joint training program, civilian and military medical personnel, trauma response, specifically, field triage protocols, mass casualty management. It's been in development for a year, and it's under-resourced on the civilian clinical side." He looked at her. "I'm on the advisory board. I want to put your name in as a consulting instructor." She looked at him. "It's not a relocation," he said. "It's periodic, 4, maybe 5 times a year. You'd keep your position here." He paused. "Your knowledge of field medicine in a civilian clinical context is..." "It's not a common thing, Voss. What you did in that procedure room, what you saw that no one else saw, the way you read Maddox's situation from a parking lot, that's not just skill. That's a specific kind of cross-domain knowledge that takes years to build." He set the bag down, because his right side was insisting on being heard. "There are civilian emergency departments all over this country where people are going to come through the door with injuries that look one way and are actually something else. And there are nurses and residents who will miss it because they've never been in a situation where reading the room incorrectly had lethal consequences." He looked at her steadily. "You have, repeatedly. That's teachable." She thought about the procedure room, about Holt saying, "Paige left a note." He said, "Listen to Voss." About Arlen saying, "I didn't ask for your credentials. I asked for your eyes." About a 24-year-old nurse on probationary status who had done nothing wrong. About Priya Nall in Billings, who had been good at this job and been driven out of the place where she was doing it. About documentation. About how the only reliable protection against systems that want to reduce you to something manageable is the unglamorous, persistent work of recording what actually happened. About the fact that none of what had unfolded in the last 3 days would have worked without the 14 months before it. "I'll think about it," she said. Maddox looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent enough time around capable people to know what "I'll think about it" means when it comes from someone who has already decided. "Good enough," he said. The transfer van came. She walked him to the entrance, not the emergency bay, the main entrance, through the lobby where a few staff members happened to be crossing when they came through, and there was a moment when a nurse she didn't know well looked at Maddox in his civilian clothes with the careful walk of recovery, and then at Madeline beside him, and gave a small nod of the kind that doesn't need words because the words would be less accurate than the silence. At the entrance doors, Maddox stopped and turned to her. You know what the hardest part of what you did was? He said. Not the procedure room, not the documentation. He looked at her. Staying. Staying in that building for 14 months while someone dismantled your credibility piece by piece and doing your job correctly every single shift and not letting what was being done to you make you into someone who did the job badly. He paused. Most people can't do that. They either leave or they break or they start cutting corners because why bother if no one's watching? He held her gaze. You kept going because the work mattered regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. That's the hardest thing, and most people never learn it. She looked at him. She had not thought about it in those terms. She had thought about it as the only available option. Keep the record, do the work, wait for the situation to become what it needed to become. She had not thought of it as discipline or courage because it hadn't felt like either. It had felt like the only thing that made sense in a situation that didn't. But she thought about it now, about the difference between doing the right thing because someone is watching and doing it because the work itself demanded it, about the 14 months of overnight shifts and fabricated reviews and careful, quiet documentation that no one had asked for and no one had known about the fact that she had kept going, not because she believed it would end in a federal inquiry and a criminal referral and a general she'd served under showing up in a convoy to her parking lot, but because stopping would have required becoming someone who stopped. That was the thing, maybe. The thing that was teachable, if anything was. Not the tactical medicine, not the cross-domain knowledge, not the ability to read a patient from 40 feet away through a parking lot window. The capacity to do the work that matters even when no one is measuring it. Especially when no one is measuring it. To build the record not because you expect to use it, but because the record is what's real. Because in the long run, in the accounting that actually matters, what you did when no one was watching is the only version of yourself that belongs entirely to you. The doors opened. Maddox walked through. She stood at the entrance and watched the van pull away, and then she went back inside, through the lobby and up the stairs and onto the floor, where a patient in Bay 4 needed a second look at her IV placement, and a resident had a question about a drug interaction, and the shift had 20 minutes of handover left, and then it would belong to her completely. She picked up the chart for Bay 4. She got to work.